Most people picture 666 as a shadowy code, a demonic seal branded into human skin, a mark of the end times appearing suddenly in the final book of the Bible. The truth is something else entirely. What actually stood behind that number required a form of knowledge the ancient world mastered and the modern world has forgotten. This is the story they never told you, and it begins long before the book of Revelation. It begins at the throne of the wealthiest man who ever walked the promised land, in a room lined with gold, in a kingdom that seemed eternal. And it begins also on a rocky island in the middle of the Aegean Sea, where an exile wrote in code to save the lives of entire communities scattered across the Roman Empire. These 2 points, separated by nearly 1,000 years, connect through a single number, and what that number carries is more disturbing than anything a horror film has ever managed to capture. Consider what the world looked like when 666 first appeared in biblical texts. It was not in the book of Revelation. It was in the first book of Kings, chapter 10, verse 14. The text records that the weight of gold arriving to Solomon in a single year was 666 talents of gold. 1 talent weighed approximately 34 kilograms. This means that every 12 months, the king received roughly 22,644 kilograms of the most precious metal in the ancient world. To put that in scale, it equals the weight of 4 adult African elephants in pure gold. This was not coincidence, and it was not decorative detail. The biblical chronicler chose to record that specific number because it represented something any Hebrew reader of the time would have recognized immediately. 666 was the exact measure of the point where Solomon's wisdom crossed a line and became accumulation. The text of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verses 16 and 17, established 3 clear prohibitions for any king of Israel. Do not multiply horses, do not multiply wives, and do not multiply gold and silver in excess. Solomon violated all 3. He kept 40,000 horses in royal stables, according to 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 26. He accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines, as 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3 records. And he received 666 talents of gold per year. The number, from its very first appearance, was a marker of human excess disguised as greatness. Now follow what was happening in the world when the second use of that number was recorded. We are in the 90s of the 1st century. The Roman Empire controlled approximately 5 million square kilometers, an area equivalent to more than half the current territory of Brazil. Inside that empire, between 60 and 70 million people lived under the rule of an administrative machine that demanded tribute, obedience, and, increasingly, the worship of the emperor as a deity. Christian communities existed within a narrow band of survival. In cities like Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, the 7 cities of Revelation, followers of Christ faced a dilemma that had no comfortable resolution. The Roman economic system was interlocked with the religious system. To buy and sell in public markets, craftsmen and merchants had to belong to trade guilds. These guilds held ritual banquets dedicated to pagan gods and to the emperor. Refusing to participate meant losing the right to trade. Losing the right to trade meant starvation. This was not metaphor, it was actual mechanism. Look closely at what John was facing when he wrote Revelation. Most historians place the composition of the text between the years 81 and 96 of the 1st century, during the reign of Domitian. John was on the island of Patmos, a 34-square-kilometer outcrop of rock in the Aegean Sea, roughly 70 kilometers from the coast of present-day Turkey. The island was used as a penal colony. Conditions included forced labor in quarries, rationed food, and complete isolation from the communities that depended on the apostles' leadership. The exile was not prison with bars. It was something worse in certain respects. Patmos had no walls because it needed none. The sea served as the fence. The distance to the nearest mainland, crossing open Aegean waters, made any escape attempt practically suicidal without a vessel. John was imprisoned by geography, and it was in that confinement that he received and recorded the vision that would become chapter 13 of Revelation. The text of Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18, describes how the second beast would cause all people, small and great, rich and poor, free and enslaved, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, and that no one would be able to buy or sell without this mark, which was the name of the beast or the number of its name. And then comes verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and its number is 666. The key word most people ignore is the verb, calculate. The text does not say fear it. It does not say avoid it. It does not say await the revelation. It says calculate. This was a direct instruction for an intellectual operation that the original readers knew how to perform, and that operation had a name, gematria. Here is the moment when that interpretive key reveals itself. In the ancient world, neither Hebrew nor Greek possessed numerical systems separate from the alphabet. Every letter corresponded to a fixed numerical value. Aleph was worth 1, Bet was worth 2, Gimel was worth 3, and so on, with tens beginning at the 10th letter and hundreds beginning at the 19th. Greek worked analogously. Alpha was 1, Beta was 2, Gamma was 3. This meant that every name, every word, every phrase had a calculable numerical value. Gematria was not fringe mysticism. It was an everyday tool. Graffiti discovered in excavations at the ruins of Pompeii, buried in 79 of the 1st century, include inscriptions like, "I love her whose number is 545. The residents of an ordinary Roman city were using gematria in love declarations written on walls. It was part of the literate culture of the Mediterranean. And here, the narrative shifts direction. Because when researchers applied Hebrew gematria to the name Nero Caesar, Neron Caesar in the Hebrew transliteration, the result was exact, 666. Nun is 50, Resh is 200, Vav is 6, final Nun is 50, Kof is 100, Samek is 60, Resh is 200, 50 plus 200 plus 6 plus 50 plus 100 plus 60 plus 200. 666. The calculation lands with absolute mathematical precision, but the most revealing piece of evidence had not yet appeared. Some of the oldest surviving manuscripts of Revelation carry a textual variant. Instead of 666, they record 616. For centuries, this variant was treated as a copyist error, until someone realized that if the name is written in its Latin form, Nero Caesar, without the final nun of the Hebrew gematria produces exactly 616. Both variants point to the same person. The difference is explained by the transliteration the copyist used. This is not theological speculation. It is mathematics applied to ancient linguistics, confirmed by manuscript evidence. Consider the environment in which this message was circulating. Christian letters and texts of the 1st century traveled by land and sea routes that could take weeks or months to connect communities. A text sent from Patmos to Ephesus covered approximately 70 kilometers by sea. From Ephesus to Laodicea, the overland route spanned roughly 160 kilometers. Each copy was made by hand, on papyrus or parchment, by scribes who did not always command all the languages involved. The risk of interception was real. Roman officials monitored correspondence from groups considered subversive. Christians had already been persecuted under Nero in the 60s, when hundreds were executed in Rome following the Great Fire of July 64. Tacitus records in the Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, that those condemned were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified, or turned into human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. Writing the name of a Roman emperor, even one already dead, as the beast of an apocalyptic prophecy was an act that could cost the lives of entire communities. Gematria functioned as encryption. Christian readers familiar with the Hebrew numerical system decoded the message. A Roman official who intercepted the text would see only an enigmatic number with no apparent meaning. It was survival code, not numerological mysticism, but there is still one layer left to uncover, and it makes everything denser. Nero was not simply a cruel emperor. Nero was the archetype of power that deifies itself. Suetonius records in the 12 Caesars that Nero ordered a statue of himself built to a height of 37 meters, the Colossus of Nero, erected at the entrance of his Domus Aurea, the golden palace he constructed over the ruins of the Fire of Rome. 37 meters is the equivalent of a 12-story building. The statue depicted Nero as the sun god, with a crown of radiating rays projecting from his head. The Domus Aurea occupied between 48 and 60 hectares at the center of Rome. For reference, that is approximately 60 football pitches. Inside the palace, there was an artificial lake, vineyards, pastures, and an octagonal banquet hall with a rotating ceiling that showered flower petals and sprayed perfume over guests. Pliny the Elder records, in the Natural History, that the cost of construction consumed resources that could have fed entire provinces for years. Meanwhile, the population of Rome, estimated at 1 million inhabitants at the time, faced severe housing shortages in the areas destroyed by the fire. Thousands of families lived in insulae, apartment blocks up to 6 stories tall, built from wood and cheap mortar, where secondary fires were constant. The infant mortality rate in the Roman Empire hovered around 300 deaths per 1,000 births within the first 5 years of life. 1/3 of all children did not reach adulthood, and that was the man whose name summed to 666. Now step back and look at the larger picture. John did not invent the symbolism of the number, he inherited it. In Hebrew thought, the number 6 represented incompleteness. 7 was the number of divine perfection. 7 days of creation, 7 feasts of Israel, 7 branches of the menorah. 6 fell eternally short of 7. And 666 was 6 repeated 3 times in the ones, tens, and hundreds columns. It was absolute incompleteness, attempting to present itself as perfection. It was the most elaborate possible imitation of the divine, and still always fell one step behind. This concept resonated directly with the theology of the Book of Daniel, written approximately 6 centuries earlier. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, King Nebuchadnezzar orders a golden statue built to a height of 60 cubits and 6 cubits wide, 60 and 6, the numbers of human power demanding worship. And the command was clear. All peoples, nations, and languages were to bow before the image at the sound of musical instruments. Anyone who refused would be thrown into a blazing furnace. The connection between Daniel and Revelation is not accidental, it is structural. John wrote for communities that knew Daniel by heart. When those readers encountered a beast demanding worship, a number tied to 6, and an economic threat against those who refused the mark, they recognized the pattern immediately. No interpretive handbook was needed. The text was in conversation with centuries of prophetic tradition they carried in collective memory. And this opens another dimension entirely. Because Nero had died in 68, possibly more than 2 decades before the composition of Revelation. So why would John be pointing to a dead man? The answer lies in a documented historical phenomenon, the myth of Nero Redivivus. After Nero's death, he killed himself with a dagger to the throat at age 30, according to Suetonius. A popular belief arose that he had not actually died. or that he would return from the dead. Between 69 and 88 of the 1st century, at least 3 impostors appeared in the East, claiming to be the resurrected Nero. The historian Dio Cassius records that one of them gathered enough followers to alarm the Parthian Empire. Tacitus mentions the phenomenon in the histories. Suetonius confirms that for years flowers appeared mysteriously on Nero's tomb, and that edicts were published in his name, as if he was still alive and about to return to destroy his enemies. The Nero Redivivus was the cultural monster of the 1st century, the boogeyman of an entire generation. When John describes in Revelation 13, verse 3, that one of the beast's heads had received a fatal wound, but that the fatal wound had been healed, his readers needed no explanatory notes. They knew exactly who it was. The beast that died and returned to life was the literary embodiment of the terror already circulating in the streets, the markets, and the whispered conversations of the Eastern Mediterranean. But a problem now emerges that complicates everything. If 666 pointed exclusively to Nero, why did later Christian tradition expand the meaning into something universal and future-facing? The answer lies in the very nature of apocalyptic literature. The apocalyptic genre, which flourished between the 2nd century before Christ and the 2nd century after Christ, operated in layers. Every symbol had an immediate referent, the meaning that made sense to the original readers, and a typological referent, the pattern that would repeat across history. Nero was the concrete case, but the pattern was larger than Nero. The pattern was human power placing itself in the position of the divine, controlling access to the means of survival, demanding worship under threat of destruction. That pattern already existed in Nebuchadnezzar. It existed in Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who in 167 before Christ desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, sacrificed a pig on the altar, and outlawed the practice of Judaism under penalty of death, as recorded in 1st Maccabees and confirmed by Josephus in the Jewish Antiquities. It existed in Caligula, who in 40 of the 1st century ordered that a statue of himself be installed in the Holy of Holies of the temple, an order only left unfulfilled because the governor Petronius deliberately delayed it, and Caligula was assassinated before he could execute it. 666 was a mirror with infinite depth. Each generation looked into it and saw a different face. But the mechanism was always the same. Consider what it meant to live under that mechanism in daily life. A leather tanner in Thyatira, one of the 7 cities named in Revelation, worked 12 to 14 hours a day. The tanning process involved soaking animal hides in vats of human urine and dog dung, followed by manual scraping and treatment with bark rich in tannin. The smell permeated the skin, the clothing, the house. The tanner belonged to the Tanners' Guild, which gathered periodically for banquets in honor of the guild's patron deity. If that tanner became a Christian and refused to participate in the guild's rituals, he lost his trade seal. Without the seal, no merchant would purchase his leather. Without sales, there was no money for bread. Without bread, his family, his wife, and an average of 3 to 5 children, given the birth and mortality rates of the period, went hungry. The pressure was not abstract. It was the empty stomach of a 4-year-old child looking up at her father in the night. That was the real meaning of no one can buy or sell without the mark. And the mark was not a microchip, a barcode, or a visible tattoo. The Greek word used in the text is charagma, which in the 1st century referred to 2 specific things: the imperial seal stamped on official documents and coins, and the ownership mark branded onto slaves. Both signified belonging and submission to an authority. Receiving the mark of the beast in its original context meant publicly accepting the divine legitimacy of the imperial system in order to continue existing within it. The right hand and the forehead carried direct resonance with Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 8, where God's commandments were to be bound as a sign on the hand and as frontlets between the eyes. The text of Revelation deliberately inverts the image. Where the mark of fidelity to the God of Israel should have been, there was now the mark of submission to the power that made itself God. The irony was razor sharp, and the original readers felt it in their flesh. Think about the situation of the Christians in Smyrna, whom Revelation 2 verse 9 describes as living in tribulation and poverty, though spiritually rich. Smyrna was a prosperous commercial port with an estimated population of between 100 and 200,000 inhabitants. The city had one of the oldest temples dedicated to the imperial cult in Asia Minor, built in 195 before Christ in honor of the goddess Roma. The Christians of Smyrna lived literally in the shadow of worship to the state. Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna in the early 2nd century, a direct disciple of John, the same author of Revelation, was burned alive in 155 for refusing to offer incense to the emperor. When the proconsul offered him the chance to deny Christ and go free, Polycarp replied that he had served Christ for 86 years and Christ had never done him harm. The account in the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of the oldest records of Christian martyrdom, states that the flames formed a vault around his body without consuming it, and that he was finally killed by a dagger. The man who most likely read Revelation directly from John's hands paid with his own life for refusing the mark. This was not abstract theology, it was flesh-burning. And the historical record reveals something no one expected about the spread of the text itself. The revelation of John was not unanimously accepted by the early church. Dionysius of Alexandria in the 3rd century questioned its authorship. Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century classified it as disputed in his ecclesiastical history. The Council of Laodicea, around the year 364, omitted Revelation from its list of canonical books. Only at the Council of Carthage in 397 was the book definitively included in the Western canon. For 300 years, the text containing 666 existed in a zone of uncertainty. It was read, copied, revered by many, and contested by others, who feared precisely what eventually happened, that the number would become an object of uncontrolled speculation rather than a historically grounded interpretive key. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180, was already warning against the temptation to apply the number to each contemporary political figure. In Against Heresies, chapter 5, section 30, he lists names that would fit the calculation: Evanthus, Latanos, Tatan, and cautions that it is safer to await the fulfillment of the prophecy than to risk reckless identifications. The warning was nearly 2,000 years old, and it was systematically ignored. Calculate the magnitude of what unfolded over the following centuries. 666 was applied to the Pope by 16th century Protestant reformers. The title Vicarius Filii Dei, which reformers attributed to the papacy, sums to 666 in Latin gematria, though historians note that this specific title was never an official papal designation. Martin Luther was called the Beast by Catholics, using equivalent calculations with his Latinized name. Napoleon Bonaparte received the number in the early 19th century. Adolf Hitler in the 20th, by means of a system where A equals 100, B equals 101, and so on, producing 666. Every generation found its own monster in the numerical mirror, and none of these identifications used the same system of calculation. That is precisely the point that exposes the fragility of the method when divorced from its original context. The Hebrew gematria that produces Neron Caesar as 666 is a fixed system with values established more than 2 millennia ago. Applied to a name the original readers would have recognized instantly. The later calculations invent ad hoc numerical systems to force the desired result. The difference between exegesis and eisegesis is exactly this. Exegesis extracts meaning from the text. Eisegesis injects meaning into the text. But the mechanism of power that the number describes never stopped operating. Follow its path across the centuries. In every era, a system emerged that demanded total loyalty, controlled access to the resources of survival, and punished with exclusion or death anyone who refused to submit. The pattern John encoded was not a prediction of a single event in the distant future. It was a diagnosis of a permanent dynamic in human civilization. The Roman Empire demanded sacrifice to the emperor. Medieval kingdoms demanded submission to the unified church state. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century demanded devotion to the leader. In each case, there was a mark, literal or metaphorical, that separated the included from the excluded, those who could buy and sell from those pushed to the margins of hunger. The archaeological record confirms the materiality of this exclusion. Excavations in Sardis, another of the 7 cities of Revelation, revealed a massive synagogue adjacent to a gymnasium and Roman bath complex. Christians of Jewish origin in that city faced pressure from 2 sides, from the Jewish community that rejected them and from the Roman system that demanded conformity. Coins found at the archaeological site carry imperial cult inscriptions. Ceramic fragments with trade guild seals show the concrete mechanisms of economic inclusion and exclusion. None of these discoveries are abstract. They are objects that human hands held while making decisions that defined survival or death. And there is one final piece of evidence that pulls the entire narrative together. The oldest surviving manuscript containing the verse from Revelation 13:18 is Papyrus 115, dated to the late 3rd or early 4th century, preserved among the Oxyrhynchus papyri discovered in Egypt. In that papyrus, the number recorded is not 666, it is 616. This variant, which we have already noted points to the Latin spelling of Nero, means that the earliest copyists still preserved the original interpretive key. They knew the number pointed to a name. They knew which name. And they knew that the difference in spelling between Hebrew and Latin produced 2 equally valid results. The knowledge faded gradually as the text moved farther from its original context. When Revelation stopped being read as a pastoral letter to persecuted communities and began to be read as an almanac of the end of the world, 666 lost its historical anchor and drifted into the territory of infinite speculation. The text never changed. The reading is what deformed. Today, 666 is arguably the most recognizable number in the history of civilization. It appears in films, songs, tattoos, conspiracy theories, and alarming headlines. A study conducted in the United States revealed that approximately 9% of Americans admit to feeling irrational anxiety at the sight of the number, a condition that has received the technical name hexaphobia. Hotels in various parts of the world have no room 666. Highways have been renumbered to avoid it. The former stretch of Route 666 in New Mexico was redesignated as Route 491 in 2003, in part due to pressure from local communities who found the number disturbing. A number written as an act of resistance against an empire became an object of superstition, stripped of any historical meaning. And the copyists of Patmos, the tanners of Thyatira, the burned Christians of Smyrna, all those who understood the original code and paid the price of living under the power it denounced, were reduced to footnotes in debates they would not recognize. 666 was never about the future. It was about the present of those who wrote it. It was about real communities, hungry and hunted, who needed a code to name the monster without the monster finding them. It was about the courage to call power what it was: incomplete, imitative, temporary, using nothing but letters that were also numbers, written on papyrus that was also a death sentence. The number outlasted Nero, outlasted Rome, outlasted every empire that attempted to demand worship. It survived because the pattern it diagnosed never disappeared. Every era manufactures its own beast, demands its own mark, punishes its own refusers. What changes is the face. The mechanism remains. And perhaps the most disturbing piece of information is not the number itself, but what it reveals about whoever reads it. Because 666 functions as a silent test. It shows whether the reader is searching for an external enemy to fear, or whether they recognize that the real danger lies in any system, including the ones that feel familiar and comfortable, that demands absolute loyalty in exchange for the right to exist. The number does not point outward. It points at the mirror,